Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Long Range Planning Committee meeting. I'm Bill Bowie. I'm the chair of this particular committee, and it is my honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Kara Fitzgibbon, delivering the report of the analysis that they have done that has been slightly delayed. This meeting was originally supposed to take place in March of 2020. So without further ado, Dr. Fitzgibbon.
Well, thank you all. It's very nice to be here. As Bill noted, this presentation was originally scheduled for back in spring of 2020, and this is actually my first in-person presentation since the pandemic, which is appropriate because my last in-person presentation was right back here in February. And so at that time, we were able to present kind of the first unveiling of the findings from this survey. And tonight's presentation is going to zone in more on the methodology of that survey, the statistical basis those findings have, and then we're also going to more closely examine some of those findings and discuss further their ability to draw statistical inference and some of the significant differences we found across demographic groups by those differences. So to start, when RCC first approached us at CSR, the Long Range Planning Committee already had a very clear, well-articulated set of aims for the survey. And they came to us with the desire to make sure the answers to these questions, to address these purposes, that those survey results were comprehensive, they were representative, and they were statistically sound. And so to achieve that, we proposed a mixed mode, mixed probability design, where we reached out to folks and invited them to participate both by paper and online. And we had each a probability sample and a non-probability sample. And I want to put a disclaimer, this is going to start to get heavy into the jargon. So with our probability sample, what that really means when we're talking about probability sampling versus non-probability sampling, it's whether or not each individual selected, we know what their probability of selection is. So in a probability sample, every case in your sampling frame has a known, non-zero chance of selection, chance of being invited to participate. With probability samples, we have the ability to calculate response rate, to calculate margin of error, to draw statistical significance and inference to the larger population. We can run all sorts of great statistical tests, but all of those assume that the data you're working with is drawn from a probability sample. So it's really critical from the get-go, if you do want to make those sorts of assertions to the larger, in this case, Reston community, that you have that probability basis. And you can draw probability samples in any number of ways and reach out to folks and give them a variety of options to complete the survey. In our case, we went with an address-based sample. So we sampled households, residential households across Reston. This sample was drawn from the U.S. Post Office list of addresses, and we followed a mail-forward design where we first sent these households a series of postal mailings and then invited them to complete on paper, as well as we had a delayed web alternative. And the probability sample, we followed a confidential protocol. So we were tracking who was participating, who wasn't. We obviously kept that information private, but we kept track of their participation so that we could target reminders to non-responding households. And for a non-probability sample, I just sang the praises of probability-based, and I feel strongly that that's an important component. But for this study, we also wanted to introduce the non-probability what we were calling the open source survey. And there were two main motivations there. One, we wanted to make sure we were reaching not just Reston residents, as RCC serves both residents, but also those individuals who work in Reston. So the open source survey was a way to enable those individuals to participate. Additionally, the open source survey was a way for anyone in the community to participate. So while our probability sample gives us the statistical scientific basis for the generalizations that we can draw from the findings, the open source survey is a way to ensure every single voice that wants to share their feedback with the Reston Community Center, they're counted and they're a part of that process. And so that's what the open source survey allowed us to do. And for that non-probability open source survey, data were collected primarily online. That was, the base was a web survey, but we also supplied RCC with paper questionnaire packets, so anyone that didn't want to participate online but still wanted to share their feedback, they could pick up those packets, and those packets included the questionnaire as well as a postage-paid return envelope that went directly to CSR, and we could enter the data. Oh, and I should note that the non-probability survey followed an anonymous protocol, so we didn't know who participated in that or any personal information or contact information, as we didn't need to follow up with those folks. Now, a bit more on the probability sample. So in this case, our population of interest is the larger Reston community. Our sampling frame here was the full list of residential addresses in small tax district 5. To pull together this sampling frame, we purchased an address-based sample from Dynata, which is a well-respected, nationally known vendor of scientific survey samples. And their sample, I think I already mentioned this, is based on the list that is compiled and maintained by the U.S. Post Office, and so it excludes things like known vacant households or P.O. boxes. We really wanted to make sure any case included in our sample invited to participate was a viable Reston resident. Additionally, in an effort to maximize the number of responses to this survey in our probability sample, we stratified the sample. And so there were 3 strata based off of the Census Bureau's low response score, which based off census participation anticipates which census tracts might be less likely to respond. So for those tracts, we increase the number of invitations sent. For the tracts where we anticipate high response, we scale back so that our final data file has a nice representation across the entire community. Now, before we actually reached out to anyone and invited them to participate, we needed to make sure that the instrument itself, the survey questionnaire, was sound and effective and comprehensive. So following a highly collaborative, iterative process of developing the survey questionnaire, we conducted a qualitative pretest where we did a focus group. So we came up to Reston and had a focus group back in June of 2019 with Reston community members, and we had them each take the questionnaire as it currently stood, fill it out, and then together debrief, share feedback. And following that focus group, we did make some substantive edits to the questionnaire. We also changed the layout, changed the order. So we felt very confident going out of that pretest that then the final instrument was ready and could address those initial survey aims presented at the start of this presentation. And that final questionnaire was formatted for the paper mailout and then was also programmed in Qualtrics, which is an online survey platform. And in order to, again, try to open up survey participation and be as inclusive as possible, the survey was translated and available in addition to English, in Spanish, Chinese, Russian, and Arabic. So on to the data collection. Presented here are a list of the main, we'll call them events, of the survey, and I've split this table by the probability sample and the non-probability sample. So you'll notice in that right column, it doesn't go perfectly in sequential order. It's split up by those two treatments, we'll call them. So for a probability sample, we followed what's known as the Taylor design method. And that is a method of mailings that are intentionally spaced out and vary in their content. And these are all designed in order to maximize participation. And so the first contact we send is an advance letter to our probability sample. And that advance letter came on RCC letterhead. It had the RCC logo, and it's stating the aims and intention behind the survey. And crucially, in that advance letter, we're not yet asking anything of the respondent. We're just letting them know, giving them a heads up. In a week or two, you're going to receive a survey packet. Here's why we hope you'll participate. Here's why your participation is important. Following that advance letter is then the first questionnaire packet. That packet includes a cover letter that varies from that advance letter. And in addition, we have the questionnaire packet itself, as well as then a postage-paid return envelope, because we want to take off as much burden as we can of the respondent and just enable them and facilitate their participation in sharing their feedback. Following that first questionnaire packet, we send a thank you reminder postcard. And then several weeks later, we send our second questionnaire packet. That packet, again, has your questionnaire booklet, has the return envelope, but in this packet, the cover letter also provides instructions for the participant to complete online. This is where we have that delayed web alternative. We provide a unique access code so we can still keep track of who's participating and how. And then our final contact to the probability sample was a closeout reminder postcard. And so here we're announcing the date of closing the survey. And this all launched on July 3rd for the probability sample. For the non-probability sample, that launched about a month later on August 5th. And the reason we stagger those two phases is that we want to ensure any household selected for a probability sample has received their invitation, they've had a chance to assess, and they know they're part of that probability sample. Because what we don't want is to have someone who is part of our probability sample instead go to that open source survey where it's anonymous, we don't know who that is, and then they're no longer counted in our probability sample. So the timing here and the pacing is important. All data closed in mid-September of 2019. So in terms of our survey response, across our two samples, we received 1,906 complete usable, we received 1,906 complete usable responses. From our non-probability sample, we had 817 responses, and from our probability, after cleaning the data and deduplicating, we had 1,089 usable cases. So the next two statistics I'm going to provide are for our probability only. Because with our open source, with the non-probability, we can't calculate a response rate. So for just our probability, we achieved a response rate of 19.8%. And then for our probability, we can also calculate our margin of error. And even though margin of error, it's a widely used measure, I'm sure you all have heard and seen it, and anytime you come across a poll or in a news article, it'll throw out the margin of error. And shorthand, it's speaking to the reliability of your results, but more specifically and accurately, what the margin of error is telling you, you're specifying a certain level of confidence. And generally what that level of confidence is then telling you is at that level, we assume that our population value falls within X percent above and below our sample statistic. So more technically, what the margin of error is actually telling you is that if you run a study 100 times, so 100 iterations of your study, same survey methodology, a different sample each time, that whatever your level of confidence is, let's say it's 95% confidence, that 95 out of 100 of those survey iterations, your population mean is going to fall plus or minus whatever your margin of error is. So for this study, we achieved a margin of error of plus or minus 3.7%. So if we did this study 100 times, we'd be confident that our population mean would fall within plus or minus 3.7% from the sample statistic we're reporting on. So this is our overall margin of error, but from one question to the next within a survey, that margin of error will adjust slightly depending on the number of responses to a given question, as well as the range of answer categories and the distribution of response across that question. So in a bit, we're going to take a look at some specific questions, and I'll provide confidence intervals for those answers. It'll generally be around the 3.7%, but you'll see it widen and tighten slightly. So these data were collected in 2019. It's now 2021. I understand you all have conducted a survey, which I'm really eager to hear the findings from. Nonetheless, I do want to take some time to refresh us on what some of those findings were, and I would anticipate we'll see some lasting trends in your survey that you all conducted recently. One point I want to make before getting into the results is that the results presented here are based only on the probability responses for the reasons we spoke about earlier. It is from our probability responses that we can, with a specified likelihood, generalize to the full resting community. However, those non-probability responses are all presented in that report that's been posted to the RCC website since early 2020. So those opinions and feedback can still be viewed and shared. Just tonight, we're only talking about the probability cases, so we can have that statistical power. So starting off, we asked respondents if they'd heard of RCC, which 94% had. You all have a very well-established brand within the community. Respondents were then asked a series of questions to gauge level of support and general opinion of RCC. 86% considered RCC to be somewhat to very important to the overall quality of life in Reston. 90% think RCC makes Reston a more attractive place to live. Turning to participation, we asked respondents about the recent use of the community center, and at that point in time, 54% of households had used RCC in the prior 12 months. In terms of ever having used RCC, we had about 3/4 of households saying at some point in time they or a family member had attended an RCC course or program or class. Respondents were also asked about their desired frequency of RCC participation. And about, again, 3/4 said they would like to participate in RCC more than they currently do. And to me, that's a really powerful statistic. I'm going to move through these pretty quickly because the world has changed, but we asked respondents of existing RCC programs and facilities, what do you consider to be the most relevant? And these are the top 4 that we had in a write-in response. So we left this fully open-ended for participants, and at least 1/4 of respondents listed at least one of these. We also asked participants, what would you like to see as a new offering? What sort of recommendations would you give to RCC for new programming? And we see here that we have age-specific, which in the open ends we're usually looking at either programming geared towards older residents or just adults-only classes, or again, programs. For the fitness and sports programming, there was a lot of mentioning of yoga, but that varied quite a bit. And then in terms of additional lifelong learning, more of that, more of the educational courses, those again varied widely from STEM courses to gardening, cooking classes, real estate. It ran the gamut. So if we know that around 3/4 of participants said they'd like to participate in RCC more than they do, it's important to then ask why and what can be done to perhaps facilitate their increased use of RCC. Towards that end, we asked about barriers to RCC use, and we presented respondents with a list of possible barriers and asked them to rate each barrier on the extent to which it is indeed a challenge for them. So let me walk you through this graph. So on your left, you have the list of possible barriers we presented to the respondent. And on the left, that red bar, that represents the selection of, this is top 5 on a scale of 1 to 5. This is a top barrier, a significant barrier. And then over to the right in the light blue, those would be selections that this is not at all a barrier for me. And we've then organized the graph. We're ranked in decreasing order. So the most widely selected barriers are at the top. And so we see being too busy is the most common barrier. That is, I'm sure, not surprising to anyone. And approximately 1/2 of respondents gave this either a 5 or 4 rating on that barrier scale. The second most commonly cited barrier was finding the current program schedule to be inconvenient, and that was followed by a lack of awareness of the existing program offerings or schedule. We can see there are other possible barriers included here. So it's helpful to see that overall, but we also wanted to understand if these barriers are experienced differentially or perhaps more acutely among certain subsets of the population. And so to do that, we ran comparative analysis of each of these barriers, looking at their means, comparing those across groups. And the differences I'm about to discuss, I do want to note that these are all statistically significant differences. So what that tells us is the difference or pattern or relationship we're finding in our survey data, we're 95% confident that that same pattern exists in the population. And I'm only discussing differences that did have that statistically significant relationship. So starting with too busy, again, this was felt overall, but when we look at specific subgroups relative to the other individuals in that group, these are felt more acutely. And so that being too busy, respondents with children in the home, I think that makes sense. Those who are employed, either full-time, part-time, self-employed, as well as those younger than 65. And when it came to viewing the program schedule as inconvenient, that was rated as a larger barrier among respondents aged 30 to 64, those with less than a 4-year degree, a college degree, and those with an annual household income less than $50,000. And then in terms of lack of awareness of existing programs, this was, again, more highly rated among respondents who had lived in Reston less than 10 years, so a bit newer to the area, those who worked full-time specifically, and or those who are between the ages of 30 and 39, or 50 to 65. We also took a look at a few other barriers, even though they weren't our top rated, but we did see a fair amount of difference among our respondents. So for the barrier of cost or finding participation in RCC or attending certain events to be too expensive, we saw that this was a higher, more highly rated barrier among those respondents who have children, those who have been in Reston for less than 5 years, those who rent rather than own their home, those whose primary language spoken in the home is a language other than English, those with less than a 4-year degree, and those with relatively lower household income. In terms of the barrier of the programs always being full, we saw that among respondents with children in the household, those whose primary language spoken in the home is one other than English, and then those whose annual household income is less than $50,000. And just one other barrier I'll talk about tonight was lack of transportation. And we found that to be a more significant barrier among respondents who are over 65, and then those with less than a 4-year degree. Turning now to communication and outreach, we asked a series of questions to understand what are Reston residents' regularly used media, and then specifically when it comes to leisure activities and RCC information, where are they getting that? And so starting with the types of media regularly used, we allowed respondents to select as many media as they felt suited their lifestyle. And we see that the most widely used media was online journalism, and we have this by just over 60% of respondents. That's then followed by broadcast television, radio, Facebook, and print journalism, all of which are around 50% of respondents selected that media. So again, I'm really interested in the demographic differences. How do we see this varying from one group to the next? So in terms of age, we saw that older respondents had a higher selection rate of broadcast TV and print journalism, whereas our younger respondents had a higher selection of Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. When we look at employment status, those who are employed, again, either full-time or part-time, relative to those who are retired, those employed respondents were more likely to select Facebook and Twitter as a regular media use. In terms of length of their residence in Reston, those who've been in Reston for longer were more likely to select broadcast TV, and they more regularly use print journalism, whereas those newer to the area selected Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and online journalism at a higher rate relative to older residents. And then those with children in the home were more likely to select Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, online journalism. And I think it's helpful to keep in mind a few slides ago when one of the top barriers of experience was lack of awareness about RCC programming. Recall, those were residents who had been in Reston for less than 10 years. They were men, and they were residents with less than a 4-year degree. And it was adults age 30 to 39, and then 50 to 65. So I think we want to be keeping in mind how can we then better get information to those folks. We also then asked specifically about where do you get information on RCC. Respondents, again, could select multiple sources. As we can see, far and away, your seasonal program guide is a hit and widely used. And then all of the others, they're still used, but they drop off a bit in terms of that really pervasive program guide. In terms of how these sources of information for RCC varies by demographics, looking at age among older respondents, relative to the younger respondents, they're more likely to get RCC information from local newspaper, from the seasonal program guide, from the center stage mailer and email, whereas your younger respondents are more likely to get their information about RCC from social media. Looking at gender, men were more likely to get RCC information from the local newspaper, whereas women were more likely to get that information from the seasonal guide and social media. Looking at length of residence, the longer someone's been in Reston, residents that have been in the area longer, more likely to get RCC information from the local newspaper, seasonal program guide, center stage mailer, and family and friends. Those with children in the home, the program flyers, the RCC website, the e-newsletter, and social media. And looking at education, those with less than a 4-year degree were more likely to get their information about RCC from local TV programming. Our final question about communications and outreach, we asked, okay, let's think more generally now, where are you getting your information about leisure activities not specific to RCC? And so there we see over half find out about these types of activities from family and friends, as well as general internet searches, and that's then followed by local newspapers and social media. You know, by now we're going to look at the demographic differences. When we look at age, our older respondents were more likely to get their leisure activity information from local newspaper, local TV, local radio. Whereas our younger respondents were going to social media and they were participating in those internet searches. In terms of employment status, this one gets a little more nuanced. So those who work full-time or are retired, they're more likely to get the leisure time activity information from local radio. I would imagine that might have to deal with a commute. And for just employed generally, full-time or part-time, relative to retired, those folks are more likely to get the information from social media. So kind of your takeaway right there, if you're trying to reach your full-time residents, go to local radio or social media. In terms of length of residence, those who had been in Reston for longer, again, that local newspaper, local TV, and family and friends, whereas those who are newer to the area, more likely to get information from social media and internet searches. Finally, those with children in the home, we have again social media, again the internet, and family and friends. The final topic of tonight's presentation is related to the performing arts venue. So we had a series of questions on that 2019 survey asking about general level of support to have a larger venue, and then what were the specific conditions under which there was support. So the first question we asked, how interested would you be in Reston having a larger venue in which to see music, dance, film screenings, other types of performances that require a big stage to host? And respondents could report based off a scale of very interested to not at all interested, and then also had a selection that they feel like the existing facilities are sufficient for that. So with these charts, we have very interested in the dark blue, and then we move in clockwise fashion, we're decreasing in the level of interest. And so we see we have about 30% of responses who are very interested. Let's focus in on those folks ranging from very to somewhat interested. So that group together compromises makes up 68% of responses. So recall our discussion earlier about with our probability responses, we can set a specific or calculate our confidence level at 95% and set an interval around the 68% that we would expect our population sentiment to fall within. And so the 95% confidence level for this particular question was between 64 and 71%. So what that tells us, we're 95% confident that the level of interest among the larger Reston community falls between 64% and 71% who are somewhat to very interested in having a larger performing arts venue. We also compare demographics on this rating. And again, while interest was high overall, we saw statistically significant higher ratings among, or by gender, length of residence, rental status, employment status, and race. Specifically, those higher ratings were among women, among residents who had lived in Reston for less than 5 years, among renters, among residents who work full or part-time compared to retired, and among Black and African American respondents. We then asked how the community felt about RCC's involvement and role in a performing arts center depending on the funding source. So in the event, the venue is built by a developer, and then RCC operates the venue on the community's behalf. We asked the level of support ranging from very supportive to not at all, and then we also gave respondents an opportunity, if they didn't have an opinion on it, they could select not sure. So the chart here has pulled out those not sure answers, which was about 10%. So these are only based off the substantive opinions, the level of support to this question. So the very supportive, we've got 37% falling in that camp. We're going to again focus on our very supportive down to somewhat supportive. Combined, that represents 80% of our respondents were somewhat to very supportive. We're 95% confident that the level of support among the larger Reston community falls between 79 and 85%, who are somewhat to very supportive of RCC operating a venue that's been built by a developer. When we look at demographic differences, again, we're not saying the support is only present among these folks, it's just relative to the others in their group, they expressed higher support. And so specifically, there were higher levels of support among married respondents, among residents who had lived in Reston for less than 10 years, among renters, among those who work full or part-time compared to retired, among Black and African American respondents, as well as white respondents, and among those younger than 40 or between 50 and 64. The final question we asked about the performing arts venue was providing a different scenario. So in the event that there was not the developer contribution, to what extent would residents support RCC financing the building through means of a bond issue? We had the same scale here of very supportive to not at all supportive and are not sure. In this case, there were about 12% who said not sure. So again, we pulled them out of this substantive analysis. We're looking just at those very to not at all supportive. Here, we can see our largest single wedge is not at all supportive. But if we again are looking at that, all right, do we have general support ranging from very to somewhat? That comprises 56% of our respondents are very to somewhat supportive. And we're 95% confident that the level of support among the entire Reston community falls between 52% and 60% who are somewhat to very supportive of RCC building the venue by means of a bonds issue. So while there's still the general support, there is the majority, we see much more variation in the level of support and not quite as strong as the trend that we saw in the prior two questions. But let's see how this varies by demographic traits. There was statistically higher support among renters, among residents who work part-time, among Black and African American residents, and among residents whose household annual income is either less than $100,000 or more than $150,000. So we see support at kind of either end of that variable. So that was a lot. I want to try to quickly just recap some of those main findings. So awareness is high among the community of the Reston Community Center. Sentiment is generally very positive. We did have about 3/4 of respondents who wanted to participate in RCC more than they currently do. We saw the top existing programs. There's big support for the community events, the professional touring artist series, land-based fitness classes, And then in terms of the recommended additional programs or classes they'd like to see, more of the lifelong learning, more fitness and sports, and then more age-specific programming. For that, the barriers to use, we have the too busy, we have finding the schedule a bit inconvenient, and we have the general lack of awareness. And I just highlighted again among which groups was the lack of awareness highest, and we see that among men, we see that among those who work full-time, those who haven't lived in Reston for as long, those with less than a 4-year degree, and those who are younger than 65. So I would use that to then inform targeted or additional outreach to those groups. In terms of the best ways to reach those people, we saw really varied use of media, which is both good and bad. It means you kind of need to keep your outreach pretty diversified. But in particular, I think an online presence is especially important in order to reach the younger residents, those residents that haven't been in Reston as long, and then also to reach those families with children in the home. Finally, there was general support for the performing arts venue. We had 68% somewhat to very interested in having the larger venue. We had 82% somewhat to very supportive of RCC operating the venue if built by a developer. And then we have 56% who are somewhat to very supportive of RCC operating and financing the building of a large or performing arts center through means of a bond issue. I will stop there, and I welcome any questions. Yes.
Just to go back to the beginning of your presentation, I just want to ask you to clarify something. The results that you outlined tonight, were they from the overall survey responses or just from the paper?
Oh, great. Thank you for that question. So all of the results tonight, let me repeat the question actually. So the question was if the results here are overall or just of the paper responses. And so the results here are just of our probability responses, the bulk of which were submitted via paper, but those probability respondents also had the opportunity to participate online, which some of them did, and we then aggregated among the probability responses, those who participate on paper, those who participate on web. We made sure to deduplicate. If someone sent in the mailing, they got a reminder, they took it online. So our probability responses, it's only one per household, but it's across modes.
So they were primarily people who live in Tax District 5?
So the probability respondents are only among households in Small Tax District 5. And so, yes, regardless of mode, that was the geographic boundary for those respondents. And also, I should have included my email up there, but I'm also happy to answer any questions that might occur to folks after tonight's presentation. But yes.
Given your past experiences and other similar studies, how have you seen statistical results like these concerning the support for performing arts center? How have those kind of matched up with, for instance, future bond issue votes and actual voting responses? Study like, you understand what I'm saying? You did the survey and then you actually voted. The numbers kind of line out.
Yeah, so this is the first survey where we've looked specifically at a performing arts venue. But generally, right, when we see actual outcomes in the community following survey findings, I think the concrete example I can give you was, so I live in Charlottesville, and it's probably 5 to 10 years ago, local YMCA was built based off of survey findings we had. And that was dealing mainly with access to swimming lessons and education and swimming competency. And so what we find is that I'm able to deliver the accurate sentiments among the community based off of these statistics. And then in terms of how that's carried forward, that's a bit up to the organizations being stewards of the community. And so it's a bit good faith that that will be carried out to represent the findings we have here. But what I can stand by is what these results show us, and then the intention is for that to be carried forward in the community. Any other questions?
Dr. Fitzgibbons, I do have one. I was looking at a lot of the stats regarding when you broke it down and looking with the fine arts venue. You broke it down, and one of the comparisons was amongst African American and Black respondents. What were this percentage you got in general? I mean, to me, I like those results there. Wrestling is diverse, and their opportunities are reaching everybody. The whole thing with equity. When you look at those numbers, is it drastically different, or I know what the stats say, but if you could try to.
So let me make sure I understand your question. Are you asking if the racial representation we had within our survey respondents match the rest in community, or are you asking on this question, how do ratings among Black or African American respondents compare to levels of support among white respondents?
The latter. The first one is interesting, but
Okay.
more the latter.
Okay, so yes, so hopefully quick comment in terms of how the statistical significance test for each of those differences is based on generally two factors. One being the sample size, and then the number of cases within each of those groups. So if we have a really small group, it's probably not going to catch statistical significance. The other thing that informs that is how strong that pattern or relationship is. And so even if you have a really small group, if there's a strong pattern there, we should be able to see it. So going back to the question about the performing arts venue and support there, and how that, what patterns we see. So still across the board, we're seeing support for the performing arts venue. It's just that level of support, which in this case we were looking at the average rating, with a 5 being strong support, 1 being not at all. We do have that higher support among, I think it was Black and African American respondents as well as white. And so that's not telling us that in this case we had 4 categories in addition to those 2 of Asian and Asian American respondents and multiracial and other racial affiliations. We didn't see especially low support in any of those groups. It was just more pronounced among the 2 highlighted here. In terms of the specific percentage breakdowns, those are in the report. I don't, off the top of my head, could tell you that, but I can follow up with you on a specific one.
That's very important. RCC is so big with their equity. To me, I was like, oh, neat. I forgot. I didn't know you were breaking it down that way. That's important to know, because that is crucial to I think the pillars of wrestling, so that was really neat too. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool.
Great.
I do want to remind people that the whole entire hundreds of pages of data that the 2019 Community Survey contains is posted online on our website, and all of the appendices where all of this demographic information is broken down and described is available in the report that's posted on our website. So while these are sort of the high level and major points of the findings, all of it is there, and there's a very useful executive summary at the front end of it that contains a little more detail in terms of these findings. And then the appendices, I recommend for those of you who love to just dive into the numbers and tear them apart and make sure that you can be confident about them. I know Dick has spent a lot of time in those appendices, and they did just a really outstanding job in terms of reaching a representative sample of the community and really asking. It was a relatively long survey.
Yeah.
It was a survey that took at least 25 minutes to complete, and to have the level of response rate as high as it was is also a testament to the level of interest there was in the community in 2019 in participating. We did a lot of advanced marketing for the survey. We talked about it for weeks. We discussed it with the community ahead of time, so we tried to lay a really receptive platform or foundation for its deployment so that people wouldn't be surprised. They'd get it. They'd be like, okay, yes, I heard about this and I want to participate. So I recommend anybody who's interested in the 2019 survey findings that you really do go and dig it up on our website and peruse it. It's very detailed.
And just to that point, I was seeing if I could find the short URL to share tonight, and I couldn't get it short enough, but if you just go to the RCC website and in the search bar, just search 2019 Community Survey, it comes up right at the top. So it's, I think, very accessible. And then in terms of navigating the appendices, as Lila noted, they're robust, but just following the executive summary and the table of contents, we do try to lay out, all right, if you're looking for those means comparisons, go to Appendix D. If you want to see the full questionnaire, go to Appendix A. If you want a more detailed discussion of methodology, there's an appendix for that as well. So hopefully it's a lot to wade through, but hopefully you can navigate it to find exactly what you're looking for. There are no other questions? Okay, great, thank you.
No, not yet. So we did a little follow-up. The board was curious to make sure that because of COVID-19, would we see people's emotional responses to our planning pillars change radically? So we'll just go briefly through. This was a SurveyMonkey survey. It was open-ended. There's nothing statistically valid about this at all. This is really a pulse check. So I don't know, Brian, if you can pull this up. You also should have copies of this. We announced this, and we did this for a very brief period from June 10th to July 16th. 267 people participated in it. It was only 6 questions, and they were open-ended. So the first question was, thinking about RCC overall, what is the first thing that comes to mind? And again, we saw that people are mirroring the results of the 2019 survey. People are enthusiastic about the offerings and the impact we have. So there were lots of responses about specific content and programming that we provide, and there were also lots of responses about the effect of that content and programming and its effect being positive. For each of these questions, we also looked at what people were saying in response when they were in less positive territory. So we organized the themes into these different categories, and in terms of other or no response, or governance and funding, which are where you would see people who have something more specific to say. The answers to this question were either no answers at all, and half of them are somewhat negative. They don't use it, it's outdated. In the governance, the answers were also a variety, but most of those answers, which in the context of the number of people involved is about 12, 13 responses, were focused on RCC needing to earn its funding from fees alone or become a general fund agency that gets funding from all of Fairfax County. Question 2 was thinking about RCC facilities present and future. What do you feel are priorities? And again, very varied themes emerged from these responses. The big takeaway for us is that modernization, maintenance, maintaining programming, and expansion were all supported. In terms of the details for no response or governance, 20% of the responses were no response, and most of those were literally no answer. And a few comments were offered, too niche, there's duplication of programs, and work with RA to avoid duplication. And again, in governance, we saw people referencing the tax and eliminating or lowering it. 4 of these answers specified that the community needs its own large recreation facility from FCPA. So that large recreation facility is on the minds of 4 of the people who responded to the survey. Question 3 was thinking about social and racial equity issues in our community. How do you think RCC can help Reston continue to be a welcoming, inclusive, and accessible place? And our takeaway from responses here is that RCC has a good reputation with respect to the work we're currently doing, but people do want us to continue to add programming and leadership that is even more reflective of cultural, ethnic, and social diversity. And in this question's no response details, most of them were really, literally no response. There were 2 very interesting comments. One was that RCC should be more demanding of social acceptance, which is hard to figure out how we would enforce that. And then another comment that was a little bit cryptic was, this is a slippery slope. I think that was referring to the question itself, I suspect, because that comment ended with more voices equal more diversity. Question 4 was about programs and services. Again, most of the current programming is relevant, and somewhat new approaches or content would be welcome. There were several comments that reflected knowledge of a program that they missed or a program that they weren't sure we still offered. The 24% of answers that were no response were literally no response. But it really tells us that the programming issue in terms of how people were feeling now as opposed to in 2019, it seems very similar if this is a reflective sample. There were several mentions of people wanting age-specific programming, so that echoed the findings of the 2019 survey. They referenced teens and they referenced older adults and their needs. Then question 5, thinking about the growing and changing nature of the community. The takeaway here is that people do recognize that these new developments in the community are going to need very conscious outreach and bringing programming to where people are, and also having new kinds of marketing products. There were several mentions of welcome kits or welcome wagon kinds of tools to help people, or even welcoming events to help people feel more connected to the community when they arrive here. Lots of no responses to this question, which tells me that it's stymieing for all of us. I think that most of the comments that were offered in this theme, the area details for no response, were also suggestions about how we can make developers make better contributions to the community to support RA. And one respondent mentioned having another community center to reach people in the corridor where these new developments are occurring. And one other respondent mentioned something very interesting, which is sort of like something old that might be new, is having clubs so that people of like interests might gather or get together because of those interests. Question 6 was a question about communications are always a challenge for us and for organizations that need audiences. And these responses echoed the responses of the 2019 survey very almost eerily. They like emailed information. They want our website to be more user-friendly, which thankfully we're working on that now. And there are a great many people who love our print product. So again, echoing the 2019 survey. And again, the no response is literally no answers. But overall, the responses, if you read them, these are literally 266 individual ideas being expressed. A lot of people talked about a website that works more effectively for them, that's scalable to phones, that has an easier process to use for enrollment or for making reservations. So that's very valuable information to us as we are in the process of designing and building and launching a new website soon, we hope. So in terms of from just taking this little temperature check, and we'll make the entire spreadsheet of all these answers available to the staff to learn from, but largely speaking, the trends in those answers are very similar to the data that we got in 2019. So although COVID-19 has certainly made all of us feel differently about many things, at least from this little pulse check of the community, the participants in this survey didn't seem to feel dramatically differently about these key issues than they did in 2019. So, now. We're adjourned.